Greetings. Welcome to Powered by Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Kwesi Kunadu. On this episode, we're going to talk about disciplining children, especially your children, and hopefully only your children. So, let's start with a story. When I was a young boy and growing up on the island of Jamaica, I spent a few months with my biological father. Now, it's a longer story as to why only a few months, but we'll just pick up the story from there. So while with my biological father was myself, my younger brother, who I'll leave nameless for purposes of anonymity. So my younger brother and I were staying with our biological father at his abode, which he shared with a woman other than my mother. He and my mother had not or ever married. And so I too was wondering, as probably you are, what am I doing over there? Longer story. But the short of the fact is that I and my brother were there living with him for a few months before we were brought up to the United States, to New York, in fact. And while there, I remember two words or two things constantly. I don't remember love. I don't remember affection. I don't remember care. But I remember two other words: call and command. Call, which he would call my name, and command. Do this, do that, do this, do that. That's the only things I remember. And after leaving his abode that he shared with another woman, I had a certain, I was going to say hate, but I disliked the man very much so. I was angry. And I hated the fact, not him, but the fact of having stayed there, wondering why I left my grandfather's abode and went over to his abode. And because I only remembered calling and command, I was often disciplined. By discipline, I mean I was often beat. And for many people in the African diaspora, in the African world, you are familiar with sort of a mostly shared phenomena whereby discipline usually means physical discipline, spanking, if you will, and even worse. And I was often disciplined by him and often blamed for things I did not do. In fact, there was a daughter of the woman that he was with, not his daughter, but another man's daughter, or the woman that he was with. And she would always come by me after one of those beatings and say, I know you didn't do it. And oftentimes she did it. So I didn't find that too comforting. But remembering after all these years being called and then command, that was the end result of discipline. In other words, discipline can make and break a child, depending upon how, when it is employed, and the reason or the purpose of the discipline and the kind of discipline. And there are different kinds. Let's go through a few, of which physical discipline is not the most important or the most significant of them all. Now, here's the premise of discipline. The premise is that, and it comes from our parents and grandparents and those thereafter, is that if you do not physically discipline the child, if you don't spank the child, or in cases beat the child will become unruly, will become essentially a bitter mark on the family's name. It will dishonor the family. It will embarrass the family. It will do all kinds of things that are unbecoming. And so discipline is supposed to be this medicine, supposed to be this one-size-fit-all elixir that takes care of everything the child needs in terms of their growth and development. Now, there's a lot that's wrong with that premise and that's wrong with that argument. For one, discipline comes down to, first and foremost, who the child is, which means that one, as a parent or guardian, has to first recognize who the child is. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean this. A parent or guardian has to first recognize what kind of child you have. There are some children who are very quiet, obedient, very much they fall in line. Their needs of discipline is not the physical kind. They can be reasoned with. You can talk to him or her, right? And they will simply follow through. They will sort of get the hang of the idea in which you're trying to convey, or the instruction, or whatever it is, for which brought usually the anger that bled out into some form of discipline. Excuse me. So, knowing the child is the most important factor in how we deploy discipline. Then you have other children who are very much loud and energetic, and they can't sit still, and they can't focus on something for more than a minute, if that much, right? Now, I'm not suggesting the child has a behavioral, psychological, or other challenge. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it just in terms of energy, right? And there's another difference. Sometimes we think a child is a problem child, that is, they have a psychological or another kind of problem, when in fact it's just energetic, right? In other words, it's an energy matter, meaning that their energy is very much antsy, it's very much ongoing. So that Duracell battery that supposedly lasts long, right? They really tire, and if they do, you can't wait for that moment. So I'm distinguishing an energy matter from a psychiatric matter or psychological matter or behavioral matter, right? And so this child may have a bundle of energy that is displayed in ways that you find annoying, unbecoming, etc., right? Angering. That child may or may not benefit, keyword benefit, from physical discipline, and may not benefit from reasoning, that is sort of auditory, intellectual discipline, right? That child may actually benefit from essentially emotional discipline, the idea of embarrassment, the idea of not feeling good about oneself, having realized or recognized what they have done, right? And that realization can come through a number of things. It can come through simply the shame or the embarrassment of having their parents cry, or having their parents or parent or guardian feel a way, which then of course has a domino effect on how they feel. Now, this is only true if the child respects and or loves and cares about the parent. If they have none of those feelings, then of course, the moral, right, or emotional approach to discipline may not be effective at all. Then you have other children who are essentially headstrong, right? Not behavioral, not energetic, just headstrong. They want to do what they want to do. They have a clear idea what they're doing. They are aware of the consequences, both negative and positive, and they will still do it because that's what they want to do, right? And when the parent asks, why did they do so? They will not lie. They'll say, I did that, and this is why I did that, right? What do you do if you're a parent, right? Do you go through the reasoning, logical, intellectual discipline? Do you go for the emotional discipline? Do you go for the ethical and moral, right? Or do you go for the physical? Sometimes it may be a combination of all three. Sometimes it may be a combination of zero. Sometimes the matter of discipline is essentially passing off the child, especially when there are two parents in the household, to the other parent. And this is why we have parents that complement each other, hopefully, more than not. By that I mean that the parents, by passing one off to the other, one parent may say that this is your child, you deal with him or her, or your turn, right? Because by having parents that have different triggers, different temperature or temperament, it throws the child off in terms of what they think they're going to expect. Because after a while, physical discipline loses its active ingredient, which is in fact some sort of stinging pain that will be etched in their memory, there being the child's memory, and that when the child thinks about doing or acting or behaving in the way that brought them to the point of discipline, physical discipline, they will remember, so we hope as parents, and therefore not do as much as the thing they were disciplined for. Much like an aspirin and much like medication on the body, the more you take medication, the more the body gets used to it, which means the weaker the effect. The more you physically discipline your child, the more it will have lesser an effect. Because the child would simply what? Its muscle would simply tense up and prepare itself for the physical discipline. Essentially absorbing, in some cases nullifying, the discipline. The child's already in their mind prepared themselves for the discipline, right? Because they know what's coming. Because if that is your only ammunition within your arsenal as a parent, right? Within your proverbial gun, if that's the only bullet you have, that bullet loses its power, loses its authority, loses its capability to bring or rein in the behavior or action that brought discipline upon the child in your mind as the parent. And so that is the folly, and that is the sort of the underbelly or the fault line for physical discipline. More often than not, and sooner rather than later, it will lose its potency. So you might be thinking, well, for those that employ physical discipline in the wider toolkit of emotional, intellectual, physical, and moral discipline of your children, because we have to agree that children need guide rails, they need to have boundaries, they need to have a sense of consequence, right? And we're told that children developmentally hit the age of reason around age 7, sometimes 6, around 7, that's 6 to 8, you might say, right? Between 6 and 8 years old, they realize sort of the, not full, but the fuller extent in terms of their own development, consequences to their actions, consequences to their behaviors. Before then, there might be some tangential or some off and on sense of discipline and consequences, or action and consequences, right? Because many of you probably wonder, well, my child is 2 or 3 or 4 and they keep doing the same thing over and over because they haven't really fixed into their being, into their bodies and their minds, this thing called consequence, right? And if they do, it may not be a solid grasp of that consequence. And so do not be deterred, or do not be think that you have lost the battle for providing your child with some values or principles and guide rails to guide them through their development. And so if one uses or chooses to use physical discipline, that physical discipline should be employed in terms of only a part of a wider toolkit, right? And that throws a child off because they don't know if or when it will come. And that will what? Increase rather than decrease its potential ability to what? Enforce the values, enforce the guardrails that are there, right? Now, I didn't say straitjacket because that's another mistake that parents make, including myself, right? I remember, I'll give you 2 mistakes. I remember very clearly with my daughters. I remember having made one of 2 crucial mistakes, and I'll share the first one with you. The first mistake that I made in terms of disciplining the children, and I will say, in their life thus far, they have been physically disciplined by me in less times on my hand, right? One hand, less times in their entire life, right? And these are teenagers now, right? So that was not, and this is really to my point, knowing who your child is, who they're not, what they're made of, what they're about. And so I made a crucial mistake when I disciplined them with my face, right? Showing that, that firm, male face and that voice, right? Using the discipline of what? Sort of the moral authority, right? Through my face, that is my presence, and my voice, right? They would straighten up. Sometimes they would turn, and they knew what that meant, right? I didn't have to physically touch them in most cases. The mistake that I made, whether I did that or in those rare cases where it was physical discipline, is that I did not go back to them after leaving them, or they left me. I did not go to them or stay with them if I'm the one that left. Give them a hug, kiss them on the cheek and forehead, and say, I love you. This is why I did this. I don't like doing this, but I also need to show you that this behavior or this action or this thing that came from your mouth is inappropriate, unacceptable, right? For this and these reasons, right? Keep it short, but to the point. I didn't embrace them with love. And so what is the conclusion that they would draw? They drew the conclusion that, yes, their father loved them, right? In sort of like a general statement. But in those moments, it wasn't love. And so they saw discipline as simply being what? An angry man, right? That, yes, the angry black man, right? It fed into that stereotype. It fed into that caricature. It also fed into the idea that their father was some kind of villain that was being, an image cultivated by some other people. And in feeding those two, the angry black man and the villain, right? Angry black villain man, right? Was born. And so each time thereafter that I was given the face and or the voice, and in rare cases, the physical discipline, is simply what? It was premium fuel filling up the 2 tanks, the angry black man and the villain. And those two begin to merge and bleed into each other, right? In a way, I was emotionally losing my daughters. And that is a big mistake that we, and I, particularly in this case, but I'm sure I'm not by myself, make in how we employ and deploy discipline, right? We parents have to think about the immediate and fuller implication or consequence. Yes, our actions too have consequence, because if their action has consequence as child or children, so do ours in terms of our response to their misbehavior and ill doings, right? So having that hug, having that kiss is a what? Is strengthening and reinforcing our emotional affective bonds in a moment where they're emotionally angry at me. You might say, hey, that's too much signal. That's the point. That if you simply leave the anger to fester, it will bleed into what? Those two categories, the angry black man and the villain, or for you, maybe the angry black woman and the villain, whatever it is, it will bleed into those categories. But by hitting the anger, right, with father in that moment, with this love, that love will smother the anger, put it in check and say, hey, I know you don't like it. Yes, it stung, or yes, right, I don't like to be mean-faced like that, but he did this out of love. And you know what? I'm going to try to do better. Or the child may say, I didn't think I was wrong, but I understand where he's coming from. If I did that I don't think I did, I know where he's coming from. That is the fuller implication or the full circle of discipline. That is when we employ it, and I've seen this in myself and in other parents, is that when we employ discipline is usually fed by what? The wood and flame of anger. Nothing good can come out of anger, except in self-defense, right? And even that has to be disciplined anger, right? Because you can kill yourself if you're too angry and your mind is not as sharp as it should be. Anger is what drives most acts of discipline, right? And this is the other takeaway. I learned from my mistakes that if I cool down and simply speak with them, right? Tell them to bring it in, which means they know what that means, to give me a hug, and I'll kiss them on their forehead, right? They know that what? It's the same misbehavior or misdeed or whatever it may be that brought up, the desire in me to check them. Doing it when you're cool down means that anger does not lead you. Anger is not the driver of the bus to discipline, because whenever anger drives the bus, and oftentimes it is anger and sometimes solely anger, right, that drives that bus, we lash out. We lash out without what? Affect, right? That is the love and care. And B, without consideration of the consequences that we have created upon them and upon ourselves by our actions as parents, right? And I've employed that, over the years, with success, more than simply just being angry, right? Now, does that evaporate or does that quench, the desire to feed the categories of being the angry black man and villain? Probably not. Maybe it does. I don't know. But I do know that there's a different response from them, right? That is, they may just come back to me another few minutes and, hey, it's like it didn't happen, right? So I've seen the difference between the two approaches, and that's why I'm sharing with you the sort of full implication of when we choose discipline, the kind we use. And because I'm referring to girl children, that's another factor or the other facet of knowing your child, right? Boy or girl, right? Age matters, maturity matters, temperament matters. One is more outspoken, one is a little more reserved, right? You got to know your child, right? Know what checks them, right? Know what allows them to be self-reflective in terms of them seeing their own mistake, right? In some cases, hopefully they can be self-correcting, right? After a while, you got to know your child, knowing essentially which buttons to push, how much to push, what sort of pressure to put, what will make them crack, what will be the balance between cracking and having, essentially no effect at all. Those all come from the accumulated knowledge and experience of knowing your child, which means that between being born as a child and between maybe about 3 years old, that's the key period to begin observing keenly, spending time with, obviously, but also observing keenly, your child or children to see what kind of child they are, or what kind of children they are, right? And if they have siblings, how one child is sort of ricocheting, bounces off the other. All of these data points will melt into sort of a library as to how and when and where, right, and why we employ discipline, whether it's psychological, whether it is emotional or moral, whether it's physical, or it can simply be what? The facial, right? That is the bodily expression of discipline, or it's through the mouth, right? Which is the verbal portion. Whatever tool we choose to use, right? Keep those questions in mind, right? I teach my children to, whenever they're angry, upset, right? To count to 3 and take 1 or 2, maybe 3 deep breaths, right? Cool down, right? And once they cool down, they can be what? Level-headed, because anger blinds, both child and adult, right? And it's one thing, for one to be blind, but if both are blind, right, by anger, the anger that caused the discipline and the anger that was produced in the child from the discipline, that the child is left in a position, right, a vulnerable position. And this is why they need to have what? That reassurance of emotional bond, affective bond, that love that sort of envelops and surrounds them, right? But here's this other important consequence of doing that. That love also what? Bleeds back into the parent, right? When they get that hug, right? And they feel that heartbeat what? Going down, right? And they feel that anger. And parents, real parents, can feel the anger, frustration in the child. They can feel when it's fake and feel when it's real. And when it is real, they too receive that love back to them. So it's not really an act of the parents and be what? Enveloping or, showering the child with love and affection and care. It is they, in turn, the parent and parents, receiving that from the child. And that full circle is what discipline is all about, right? It is our job as parents, if you are a parent or plan to be a parent, to make sure that our children have values and principles and essentially moral, ethical guardrails, right? They're right or wrong, but more than that, more nuance than that, right? Because life isn't about right or wrong or simply, 2 binary points. It's about the in-between, right? In between. That's why we have a toolkit, a range of toolkits in terms of how we think about, as conceive of discipline, and how we deploy or use discipline in circumstances where we think one particular tool in a measured way can be more effective than the other. And finally, we all make mistakes. And so in the process of doing all that, and you end up that, hey, I use physical discipline when I should be emotional discipline, and go to the child and apologize, right? That is, take the lowest seat, right? Apologize and say, hey, I should have did this for what you did. I used the wrong tool, right? Apologize. You don't know how much respect, even a child is physically hurt or emotionally hurt from what you did, that child will respect you, right? Because you lowered your authority, you lowered your sword and shield and said, hey, I made a mistake, right? And when they embrace you, and hopefully they do, right? Either that day or another day, because sometimes it may take a while for them to, get it all through their system or out their system, depending upon how much you beat them or discipline them. That child will respect you, and that respect will grow because they say, hey, my parent is humble enough, right? And is an example of the values you're teaching by saying, if you're wrong, no matter your size or your age. And that, to me, in my experience, goes a far-reaching way, right? And that, to me, is probably one of the most greatest outcomes of discipline, is that you, the parent, can model and be the practical example for what discipline looks like, both from the child side and the parent side, because what brought on discipline in the first place? Sometimes it's a mistake, right? Sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes it's an accident, right? Apologize. Take the lowest seat, and in doing so, you get more out of it in the short and long term with your child than if not. As some parents would say, I'm never wrong, right? And if I'm wrong, I'll never tell them. That has consequences, immediate and long term. I suggest the former, not the latter. For Powered by Nyame, I've been your guide and host. Please drop your questions, comments, experiences in the comment section below. Until next time, stay well.